I keep a sourdough starter without discarding any. Here I have an old peanut butter jar where I keep a scant amount of starter. Right now it's right around 50 or 60 grams. I keep that in the fridge and just pull it out when I'm ready to make a dough. And then when I'm ready to make a dough, I just add as much starter as I need. For one half size dough, I use about it's 117 grams, but so I basically 120 grams, 60 of flour and 60 of warm filtered water that I will feed it with. You may do this and may find that you need to discard very occasionally. Like, for instance, if you've left it in the refrigerator for a long, long time, months maybe. But even in the case where I've had to do that, I've given it one small meal, like say 30 grams of flour, 30 grams of water, and give it some time for the wild yeast to activate, and then give it another small meal and use that for my starter for my dough. Here I am, the starter is matured. It had only taken 4 hours, which is kind of amazing. Mine's very active. And here I'm just adding as much as I need. I put the lid back on. I'll put that jar right back in the refrigerator until I'm ready to mix the dough again. For the water and the salt in this dough, I had heated up the water in the microwave again, just so it was around body temp, so that it makes it a little easier for the salt to dissolve and also for the starter to break up in it. And whenever I added the starter to the water, was I didn't care. It doesn't have to be mixed all that well. But one thing that I have found is that King Arthur bread flour, it's so annoying how well it works, because it is about twice as much as any other flour, but really it gives beautiful results every single time. And so that's what I use for every dough. And here you see I'm doing that last finishing mixing step with my hand. And the end result is going to be a very shaggy, very sticky mess. And that's the way it's supposed to look. With bread, you need either work or time. The work would be in the kneading. The time would be letting essentially the wild yeast do that kneading work for you. And I'm lazy, so that's what I'm doing. And speaking of lazy, whenever I do those stretch and folds, I don't pull the dough out of the bowl and stretch it on the counter. I just leave it right in the bowl. I pick up the dough, I let gravity do that stretch work for me and pull it down, and do that 4 times before I let it rest. In between the stretch and folds, you're going to see a big change in each one. Here you can see the dough is looking a little bit smoother and silkier and softer, and you'll feel it when you're stretching it too. It's going to give you a little bit more resistance. And then in that final stretch and fold, you're going to feel a lot of resistance. It's going to be silky and smooth, and it's not going to want to stretch very much at all. And again, wet hands help keep it from sticking to your hands too much. And once I've finished this final set, it's going to go into the fridge for a cold ferment. Here I've been fermenting this dough for 12 hours. The recipe says 24, but because my starter is so active, you can see those gas bubbles there. I really don't have to do it that long. And the reason why you ferment longer is to allow flavors to develop. The more you ferment, the more sour it's going to become. But I also find that the longer I ferment, the less the dough eventually rises. So that's where it's good to experiment a lot with your doughs. And that's why I like making half-size doughs, because I'm less invested in not wasting. So I've floured my surface. I've also wet my hand to help me get the dough out of the bowl. And I am stretching it out to remove some of the big gas bubbles. Not all, I'm not entirely degassing the dough, but I want to get any of the big bubbles out so that they don't come out that way. There aren't big holes in the final loaf. And I've stretched it out into kind of a square shape, removed all of the big bubbles, and I'm folding it back over onto itself in what's called an envelope fold. The inside there is still sticky, so it will stick to itself, and that's what I want. And then I'm folding it into, it's almost a round shape. And here you can see I'm going to pop one of the bigger bubbles that come up in that shaping. And next I'm going to show the baking vessel I use, which is literally a Pyrex mixing bowl. And I use this because I want the dough to rise upward. This dough that I use is very wet, and if I tried to bake it on a flat sheet, it would kind of turn into a pancake. And this way, it means that I get a higher dough, a higher rise, and it makes it a lot better for toast and sandwiches and those things. And I also use another mixing bowl rather, to use as its hat to trap that steam. And here's the final shaping that I'm going to do. I flattened it out just a little bit, and I'm pulling in those corners and sticking it to itself. It looks kind of like I'm wrapping like an old diaper or something. And I pull in four corners, and I pull the other, the little parts that are sticking out, and popping those big gas bubbles so those don't end up in the final loaf. And so I'm pulling them in, rolling it up, and then rolling it back out onto the counter. Here's where I want that smooth top, and that's why I used the flour to make that surface nonstick, but I don't want too much flour because the tightening here, I want some drag across the counter. And I'm being very gentle in here because I wanted to go slow so that I could demonstrate, but you do not have to be this gentle. Just make sure to tighten that up without tearing the top. It's going to make the scoring part a lot easier at the end. And I will put a little bit of flour on the top before I put it into the baking vessel, and that's going to help dry out that top skin part even more, which will again make scoring easier. And at the end you see that skin is very tight and the dough is very bouncy. And I'm going to put it into my baking vessel, which I have greased with butter. You could use parchment if you would prefer a vegan option, and put it in a warm place. I've put it on top of my toaster oven here, and I feel like that makes it develop a little bit faster. For me, it takes about 2 hours. It could take up to 3, and just give it a little rest. Now I've let it rest for about 2 hours. You'll know it's ready to score once you press down on the dough and it leaves an impression. Now there are wonderful scoring tutorials out there, because I am not the best at it, because honestly, I don't give a shit. I don't care how good my bread photographs. I want it to taste good. And though part of it tasting good is it having a good rise. The reason why you score sourdough is because of that skin. If you don't score it, that skin will seal and then it won't rise. So you want that air to escape, and you don't want that skin to seal. I'm doing a super basic cut. It's in an X, though I have the razor at a 45-degree angle. And once I'm done cutting that, I will score the corners so those peel up a bit. But who knows how it's going to turn out. I feel like this is the fun part of sourdough. I also do tie-dye. And the fun part of tie-dye is that when you take off the rubber bands and you rinse it out and you see what it looks like, not the hours and hours of labor before that. But at least with sourdough, I can just do the fun parts. And all of the earlier stuff, all of the trying to figure out percentages and all that, I don't want to do that. So here I just get to do the fun part. And once I'm done scoring it, I'll put on the other mixing bowl as its hat. I spray it with water to create more steam. I don't know if it's necessary, but I do it. And then I'll also give you a little photograph of what it looks like inside the oven. Inside my janky oven. It's almost 50 years old. It doesn't have consistent heat. Let me tell you what, when I replace that oven, I am going to set this world on fire. Until then, I just set it at 450 degrees. Who knows if that's the actual temperature? And I leave it in there for that first bake for 50 minutes. Here's that first big reveal. This was a little difficult by myself. Look at that, take off the hat. Look at that. Viola. It's bread. Okay. So now I'm going to bake it until it reaches an internal temperature of 210 degrees. That's why I said that I don't really care that my oven is leaky, that it's not great. I get way better results using different ovens, but I'm really just going by the internal temperature. And there you go. Even with junk supplies, you can make bread.